Nadar Hashemi, professor of Middle East politics at Georgetown University. Nadar, good morning. It is good to see you once again. So let's begin by talking about the truce. It's extended yet again for another day. How hopeful are you that it can go even further?
I'm hopeful, but the problem now is that we're on a 24-hour cycle. Before we had a 4-day truce that was extended for 2 days. Now it's 24 hours that this truce has been extended, and it's predicated on the willingness and the ability of Hamas to release Israeli hostages for an extension of the truce by 24 hours. And we're getting to a point now where I think most of the Israeli women and children have been released. Once that's accomplished, Hamas is going to demand a much higher price for the men that they have in custody, particularly the IDF soldiers. So that's going to make the diplomacy and the negotiations over extending this truce much more difficult. But let's not also forget the bigger issues about the future of the Gaza Strip, the future of Hamas, how to resolve the Israel-Palestine conflict. Those are the big questions that no one really has dealt with before. So that's very much the 800-pound gorilla in the corner that really hangs over this particular conflict.
And it's at least part of the focus of Blinken's trip, what happens post-war after the conflict. In the meantime, Nadar, do you think that Hamas, in a sense, wants to get rid of some of the hostages? Were they becoming a bigger problem for them? What to do with them, how to keep them? What do you think Hamas's position is right now on keeping these people underground?
Well, it's tough to know exactly what they're thinking. I think one point that's non-controversial is that holding these hostages gives Hamas leverage over this conflict. They're basically able now to set the tempo of this conflict when there's a humanitarian pause, when that ends. I think keeping the hostages for long periods of time in the context of brutal devastation in the Gaza Strip, where humanitarian organizations are saying the big problem now is not the war or the bombing, but the spread of disease and malnutrition. Having hostages that Hamas holds die while they're in custody doesn't help Hamas's public relations campaign. So letting some women and children go in exchange for a truce, in exchange for getting Palestinian prisoners released, does help Hamas, I think, in the short term. So I think that's the calculation. But as I mentioned a moment ago, there's roughly about 150, men of fighting age, many of them IDF soldiers that Hamas holds, and it's not going to let them go for an easy price. It's going to demand something much higher, perhaps more high-profile Palestinian prisoners that Israel holds. So that's when the negotiations are going to get very difficult.
Israel was very clear in its goal to wipe out Hamas. Do you see any possible scenario where the fighting doesn't begin again? Is there a diplomatic way to get out of this, or do we call it a permanent ceasefire? Nadar, what are the options for Israel right now?
Well, Israel has stated that it wants to get rid of Hamas. I don't think there's a military solution to this conflict, either in Gaza or more broadly to the Israel-Palestine conflict. We have to be dealing with root causes. And the problem is that Israel's closest supporters in the world, primarily the United States, prior to October the 7th, had basically abandoned any interest or effort in investing in diplomacy to solve the Israel-Palestine conflict. Everyone was focused on what's called the Abraham Accords, trying to sort of facilitate normalization between Israel and various Arab dictatorships and calling that peace and ignoring the Palestine question. Now we're seeing what a colossal miscalculation that has been. And so I think, right now the Biden administration is trying to figure out what to do, but they're very much focused on the immediate sort of concern that your question just alluded to. What happens when the truce ends, when there's no more hostages that are able to be released and the fighting begins? Israel wants to, wipe out Hamas, and the United States and the international community is very worried about rising, humanitarian crisis in the Gaza Strip. We have, 2 million people crowded in the southern part of the Gaza Strip. Most of their homes have been demolished. They have nowhere to go to, and Israel wants to renew the war. And it's unclear how they can, accomplish their war aims without perpetuating the type of immense humanitarian suffering that we've seen over the last 6 to 7 weeks.
Nadar, do you think a two-state solution is closer or further than it's ever been?
I think in the short term, it's much further away. It's very tough to sort of see the sides coming to the bargaining table in the immediate aftermath of the death of 1,200 Israelis and about 15,000 Palestinians, including over 5,000 Palestinian children. But I think on the plus side, if one wanted to say something, as tragic as the events have been over the last 6 to 7 weeks, now the question of a two-state settlement, of justice for Palestinians, security for Israelis, is now at the top of the global agenda, where prior to October 7th, everyone had forgot about that topic. And I think at the end of the day, most reasonable people realize that the best guarantee for Israeli security over the long term is a Palestinian state. I think that's what most reasonable people realize. How to get there is the big question. And I don't think the parties in Israel and Palestine can do that by themselves. It's going to require a serious commitment from the international community, led by the United States and by Canada and other people who, claim to be friends of Israel, claim to support, justice for the Palestinians. They're going to have to, I think, invest very deeply in diplomacy to try and push this conflict in the right direction.
Nadar Hashemi. Nadar, thank you so much. Nadar is a professor of Middle East politics at Georgetown University.